Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Research Connection Speaker Series. My name is G, and I'm the Research Engagement Manager at the Autodesk Technology Center in Boston. This series of presentations emphasizes our team's collaborative efforts and the pioneering advancements in the industries Autodesk is a part of. If you have an external speaker you think would make a great fit for our series, please invite them as a speaker. And I will now hand it over to our sponsor, Wang. She is the principal research scientist at Autodesk and will be introducing today's speaker to give insight into their connection.
Thanks.
Off to you. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. This is E. Today, it's our pleasure to have Max Kreminski from Midjourney to give us this talk. So Max is a research scientist with a research focus on artificial intelligence, human-computer interaction, and creativity. He designs and develops AI-based creativity support tools to assist the human designers and artists, particularly in this domain of storytelling, poetry, and game design. Currently, he is leading the storytelling tools research lab at Midjourney. He's also he's also assistant professor of computer science and engineering at Santa Clara University. I met Max at the experimental game workshop at the Game Developers Conference this year. In the workshop, Max was presenting a word game like Scrabble, but instead of real English words, you have to play with nonsensical words that only sound like English words to the AI model. Although the game sounds silly on the surface level, it actually touches upon a quite important problem about using generative AI models for creativity supports. If generative models by definition only give you the most stereotypical or mediocre outputs, then how do we achieve any creativity with it? And I'm sure Max today will share a lot of insights on that problem and how to use AI models for creativity support in general. With that, I will hand over to Max.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for that introduction. That was really great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about AI for storytelling with the subtitle of Lensing the Imagination. And what that metaphor exactly means, I'll get to at sort of like the pivot point of the talk about halfway in. But yeah, broadly speaking, right now I'm running the storytelling lab at Midjourney. I've been doing that for about 9-ish months now. And over the course of that time span, we've been prototyping a whole bunch of different interesting stuff that I'm going to talk about today. My background is actually in AI-based storytelling games research. And I did my PhD at UC Santa Cruz in this lab called the Expressive Intelligence Studio, where my advisor was Michael Matthias, one of the people who made this game called Facade that you may or may not have heard of in the context of early AI-based storytelling games. And Facade, sort of depicted on the left here, was published in the early 2000s. It basically involves you walking into this sort of tense, dramatic situation where you're visiting a couple of your friends who have gotten together, and this is like the first time you've seen them in a while, and you're sort of coming over to their apartment, and they're clearly having relationship problems. And over the course of you walking around this apartment, you can kind of interact with them however you want. You can actually type in whatever you want to say and have them respond directly to that. It was using very early natural language processing techniques to kind of parse your utterances and turn them into things that can advance the story in different ways. And broadly speaking, there's kind of an AI system in the background puppeteering these two characters and kind of trying to integrate the things that you're saying and doing with this overall sort of narrative backbone that keeps things moving forward in dramatically interesting sort of ways. So this is what I would call the AI as drama manager framework of AI design. And the idea here is that AI is kind of telling players a story, and players are participating actively in that story by embodying a character, walking around in the world, doing and saying things, and having that character's actions kind of advance the plot. Now, this is quite reminiscent of the DM or dungeon master that we see in tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, where again, there's a single person whose job it is to come up with sort of a pre-scripted narrative arc, incorporate what the players are doing when they act as their characters into that plot, and keep things coherent and on the rails and moving forward towards some eventual storytelling goal on the basis of this relatively pre-scripted scenario that they're trying to sort of walk you through as players. And The thing about being the DM in D&D is that it's a super demanding role. You have a lot of creative responsibility assigned to you. You have to do a lot of pre-session prep to figure out what that story is that you want to tell and how you're going to try to tell it today. You have to kind of anticipate what players are going to do in response to things you're narrating, and hopefully have plans laid out for the most common things you think they're going to probably try. And when they throw you a curveball, do something that you're not expecting, you suddenly have to like replan your whole story to try to get them back on the rails, or at least incorporate their actions in a way that somehow preserves the integrity of the plot. So this is super demanding for players to do. You typically don't become the DM until you've been like a normal D&D player in a few sessions first, because you have to do a lot of like onboarding to get involved in that role. And when you have an AI trying to act as a drama manager, you're placing similar creative demands on that AI system. And the current forms of AI that we're popularizing right now, especially language models, can't really handle it quite yet. And there's two main reasons for this. I call these unoriginality and uncontrollability. Unoriginality is the thing that was talked about in that introduction very briefly, where language models in a storytelling context tend to lean very heavily on tropes and cliches and easy morals, common idioms. It tends to tell instead of show in the narration. And in general, these things don't make for particularly good or interesting prose or narrative directions. You end up with kind of a pastiche of things that have been in the training data somewhere, remixed in ways that are sometimes interesting by mere juxtaposition, but that are often kind of missing the spark of originality that we're really looking for in like a great, compelling story. And this is kind of an artifact of how we train and how we sample from these language models. We both train them to kind of reproduce the most statistically likely possibilities, and then also sample from them in a way that tries to keep them coherent, which again means coming up with things that are quite likely so it doesn't go off the rails in weird directions. If we try to push against this unoriginality, we find that we have strong problems with uncontrollability. And this is kind of the flip side of the language model coin. In particular, if you're trying to prescript some sort of narrative throughline or backbone, getting a language model to stick to that script and actually keep things moving along that backbone, especially when the players are injecting chaos in to the overall narrative by doing and saying random things you didn't anticipate, is actually quite difficult. And this is especially the case as stories grow in length and start to exceed the context window that the language model can actually process completely. And so these problems of originality and controllability are things that have haunted all efforts so far to make language model-based storytelling experiences, especially with the AI and this kind of dungeon mastering role. Now, there's actually been, in tabletop game design, a movement away from these D&D style games with a DM towards what we call DM-less games. And these are things like Microscope and The Quiet Year depicted on the left. And in these kinds of DM-less games, we find that creative authority is tending to be distributed between players more equally. The DM role is often broken up into different facets that different players can embody. Maybe one person might be the role of death, and like whenever a character is dying, they're sort of brought in to decide what happens in that death scene. Whereas somebody else is maybe the person who introduces new characters to the story or has some additional like sort of responsibilities of that type. And as a result of this distribution of creative responsibilities, we also see less one-on-one player identification with a specific character that you're portraying, and more collective ownership of story world entities. So single players might jump around between which character they're controlling at any given time. Characters might be kind of owned collectively, and you can kind of take more of a narrating perspective on the story than the participant perspective of being one character at a time. And again, there's often less prescripting of narrative direction in these scenarios and more open-endedness. These games start turning into an experience that's intended to draw out interesting original ideas from these different players and kind of intermediate between them as they try to turn those ideas into a coherent world where everyone's ideas are playing a role in shaping that plot. And we can actually borrow or draw on these types of approaches to game design in having users work together with an AI, as long as we can get users to take more creative responsibility than they're used to taking in a traditional narrative video game. And in fact, both of the most successful language model-based storytelling games so far, in my opinion, are games that give over a lot of creative responsibility to players. AI Dungeon is one that you might be familiar with. This is one that was very early in the history of language model-based games, and they started out very much like explicitly framing this as a D&D style like experience. You as the player come in, you're controlling a particular fantasy character. The AI is acting directly as a dungeon master. It presents you with some narration text, and then you pick which of these several options you're going to perform, and then it sort of advances the plot based on the actions you're taking. But over time, and especially in more recent versions of AI Dungeon, they've moved more and more towards an interface where you're not actually just acting as a single character. Instead, you're able to retry generations if you don't like what you get out. You're able to edit directly the text of a generated response, so you can actually change what happens in the story at the narrator level and not just the character level. And you can even change whether you're acting as a character or typing in text as the narrator yourself. To basically say, okay, and now the thing that happens in the story is this, and you can't overrule me because I am the DM now. And in fact, people are starting to use these systems, like AI Dungeon, for instance, as novel writing assistants. So over on the right, you see this massive table of contents of like a 159-page novel, like fantasy story, that someone has basically written with AI Dungeon as their creative collaborator. And this is a more and more typical use case of these things as players start to realize that it's fun, if a little bit more difficult, to take creative responsibility and drive things in interesting directions themselves. And the other game that I consider to be the most interesting of the language model-based storytelling games so far is 1001 Nights, which again actually explicitly frames the player as the main storyteller of the experience. You're telling stories together with this AI-based character, the king, but the king is not the one leading the storytelling direction. You're actually taking your own open-ended text inputs as the primary inspiration or the primary driver of the plot, and the king is just kind of riffing off of those and giving you what happens next in these very brief statements. And so you kind of go back and forth with the king telling a story together, but ultimately you are framed as the storyteller, and it's more about the directions that you want this plot to go than the AI sort of generating a backbone and trying to hold you to it as you progress through a linear scripted narrative. So these are actually most of the compelling AI-based storytelling experiences so far, I think. And these have directly influenced the design of Patchwork, which is the thing that we're building in my team at Midjourney right now. This is a collaborative AI-supported world-building canvas with images and text in the same space. They're kind of laid out like index cards that you can drag around in a microscope style. And there's a lot of chaining between images and text here. So you can do things like have the AI tell you about the character that's in this image. Or once you've generated a text description of a character, paint that character as a series of portraits, and then maybe pick the portrait that you think most reflects them, that kind of thing. Aspects of the story world that have been generated already are taken into account when you're generating new scraps. So things like style of existing images can sort of influence the generation of future ones. The text that you've already put into the board describing the high-level properties of this world can then be used to steer character generation and so on. And the idea here is really to help a group of users collaboratively build up a shared coherent feeling setting in real time in a way that contains more ideas than they would be able to fit into the ideation process if they were acting alone or unsupported. And as a quick walkthrough of what this might look like workflow-wise, you might start out with a very high-level setting prompt, something on the order of like starships shaped like organs, just this very simple four-word thing. You get out some initial sort of like weird-looking, bio-horror-ish images from this. You might decide you like the style of one of these images, and you want to use this as the visual look of your primary sort of like character portraits. So you pick that out as a style reference. We ask the AI to actually generate a character that's based on the setting prompt and the images that we've got so far. We get this character named Tensha Hartley, an empathetic yet impulsive spaceship pilot who values freedom and often clashes with the regimented crew she transports. So a character that's sort of motivated towards conflict with other characters by this particular sort of hook that's been built into her backstory. And then based on this, we can actually ask for a foil character. So somebody like Tilda Brasslong, a brash and serious-minded engineer who values safety over efficiency and often argues with Tensha. And we can actually see that the personality conflicts between these characters are being reflected to some extent in the aesthetic sort of like renderings of these characters as well. Tensha's got this more organic sort of like weird tubey helmet, whereas Tilda's got this much more mechanical-looking rigid brass helmet, and that kind of reflects their personalities and sort of draws out how they're different from one another. We can also take these character portraits as character references and then start to generate panels basically depicting these characters doing certain actions. So here's Tensha sitting in her command chair, sort of navigating a spaceship or something like that. And these character references enable us to start building up essentially sort of mixed textual visual comics or similar kinds of stories from these raw materials that players are putting on the board. However, there is still a catch. And the catch is mostly around that setting prompt stage where you type in the very basic high-level description of the world that you want to create. And the catch is essentially that current language models are not good at generating divergent material given a similar initial prompt. We actually did a study of this in the ideation process. We compared ChatGPT and this Oblique Strategies deck, which is a much older creativity support tool, which is actually a deck of cards introduced in, I think, the 1970s or 80s by these artists, Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt, to basically help you get unstuck during the creative process. So you draw a card from this deck. It has a weird evocative phrase on it along the lines of like, make a sudden, destructive, unpredictable action. And then you have to figure out what that means in the context of your particular creative scenario. So again, when people are asked to do open-ended ideation, both on sort of like high-level story concepts and also on like product improvement ideas, we find that they are generating more homogeneous ideas when they're using ChatGPT. And that holds true even if they're modifying the ChatGPT outputs, rejecting a lot of those outputs, and so on. So the language model is actually influencing people towards greater homogeneity, greater similarity to one another in the ideas they're producing, because it injects similar ideas into the process when you have a similar ideation context. And so getting away from this homogeneity problem is what a lot of my work has been directed towards. We can rephrase this problem as something that's obviously, I think, kind of like straightforward, right? When people insert similar inputs into the same models, they get similar outputs. And this suggests three main things that you can start to modify or address in order to try to solve these problems of homogeneity. On the model side, I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but there's a few different approaches that can be tried. One is to use a wider range of models. Different language models tend to have seen different data during the training process, which means they respond to the same prompts a little bit differently. This is getting less and less true over time as they start to be trained on more and more overlapping data sets, and especially as we use synthetic data from one model as the input to other models during the training process, which means that everyone starts to sound like ChatGPT, basically. So this is not a viable strategy in the long term, I don't think, unless you're very careful about data curation. Alternatively, we can try to improve the diversity of model outputs via sampling or fine-tuning strategies. There's these whole array of strategies called diverse decoding and quality diversity sort of strategies and so on. And Daphne Ippolito's work is very strongly, I think, inspirational in this category. She's done a lot of cool stuff to basically change how we sample these models in order to get them to generate more diverse outputs that sample from a wider range of their training data when appropriate. I'm not going to focus too much on this here, but this is definitely a thing that we're interested in doing more in the future. Okay, so if we're not going to change the models too much, what we can start to do is change how we use the outputs. And in particular, reframe outputs as things that are not final prose or final images necessarily, but as maybe feedback or questions or evocative phrases that sort of help you think of what you want to write. And then the user actually has to come in and weave those outputs into something more coherent or complete looking. So trying to basically avoid prematurely foreclosing the creative process by generating something that looks too finished. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this means in our particular patchwork context a little bit later on, but this is something that we are doing and something that I think is a really interesting design approach. But the one that I'm most focused on is actually looking at the input side and what we're feeding into these models in the first place. If feeding in similar inputs, and especially short inputs, gives you very similar outputs typically, then one thing that we can try to do, which I think is very obvious, is augment user inputs with chaotic inputs from some other source. We can do things like, drawing from a deck of cards to basically insert additional advice to the model. We can do things like sampling from a generative grammar or some other traditional generative method. We can even build more complicated, elaborate symbolic systems like planners and simulations that we then use as semi-random inputs to the language model so that we get something that's more conditioned on a broader range of input than you'd be able to do with just the very brief user prompts alone. And so what this looks like in practice, I've built a few different things that go in this direction. And one of these things is called loose ends. So loose ends is a system I built during my PhD. You can see that it's basically trying to do a combination of planning and simulation to move stories forward in directions that are consistent with what the player wants to do, but that doesn't require them to do all of the work themselves of figuring out what happens next. On the left-hand side here, we've got this cast of characters under the who is involved header. We've got the story so far under the what has happened header. We've got suggestions for what might happen next under the what happens next header. And each of these sort of actions at the bottom left is a button that you can hover over. And if you click it, it adds that action to the story. You can also see that highlighted in orange here, we're sort of considering the Bella make progress on major work action. And on the right-hand side, this where are we going panel basically describes the storytelling goals that the players have put down into the system so far. So they want to advance these various threads of the narrative. For instance, Bella sort of creating a major work of art as one of the things that's going to happen in the story in the future. And each of these actions can kind of advance some of these storytelling goals on the right. And you can see with the highlights here that this particular action would move forward Bella's progress on that major work of art that she's building. So this is an attempt to kind of take the random opaque simulation stuff that we're doing on the back end and augment it with a little bit of user in the loop planning to help users steer these random chaotic outputs of these symbolic systems in a way that we can then ultimately feed this into a language model and get more interesting story outlines out of those language models. Now, on the back end, what these storytelling goals unfortunately look like is this. And as you can see here, this is a really kind of gnarly constraint programming language where we've got this, we're trying to describe maybe a violation of hospitality microstory, which consists of a sequence of events where in the first event, some guest character enters a town. In the second event, some character who's not them shows them hospitality by maybe like giving them a meal or a bed for the night or something like that. And then before that guest character leaves the town, their host actually harms them in some way and kind of violates this hospitality custom. If we want to tell stories in a very diverse, open-ended array of domains, think about how many of these patterns we would need to author, right? You need to hand engineer like, thousands, tens of thousands, who knows how many, to be able to cover a legitimately wide array of different possible stories. And so this is essentially a non-starter just for authoring problem reasons. You can't write enough of these to make this a viable approach for totally open-ended storytelling. What we've done as a result of this is moved more and more towards higher level abstract descriptions of what stories look like. And so we're actually moving towards this framing of what we call narrative functions, where each scene or each passage of text in a story can be interpreted as performing a particular function, like maybe introducing a character or adding some conflict between two characters or something like that. And we can actually generate a high-level sort of outline of advice for the model as a sequence of narrative functions that should be performed one after another. And so we have some very lightweight constraint rules here that define things like, oh, we should never do the same function twice in a row. Or we should always make sure that every story outline has some kind of character conflict in it, so we don't generate completely conflict-free stories, that kind of thing. And this approach is definitely showing more promise than this much more, hard-coded approach to describing all the things that could happen in a story symbolically and planning them together. But even so, this still does have some opacity, and it's difficult to make a good user interface for these kinds of constraints that users can themselves directly mess with. So this is an ongoing area of work. Can we build sort of a good GUI that compromises between the open-endedness of the constraint language and the language model versus the necessity of rendering this in a user interpretable way? Okay, so this is all on the input side, stuff that we can probably do to try to influence the model towards more interesting original directions. But there's actually a strategy on the input side that I haven't discussed yet, and this is the one that I'm most excited about, which is just getting people to put more diverse inputs into the models in the first place. And this is where that lensing the imagination framing comes in. What we can essentially do is reframe the process of LLM-assisted creativity as a process of eliciting user intent, getting more ideas out of people in order to push the creative process in more interesting directions. And rather than having the language model try to generate the originality, have the language model essentially try to draw originality out of people in a way that we can then weave it into a more coherent and complete story. There's a bunch of problems with trying to do this. These are all HCI problems. One of these is underexpression of intent. Typing in what you want is actually kind of tedious and time-consuming and painful, so people don't want to type in more words than they have to. So they end up with these very short prompts that don't actually fully express what they want to see. Fixation is a big problem if you try to infer from their actions alone what they intend or what they're interested in seeing in a story. Users tend to become focused on a particular specific way of achieving their expressive goals, and that makes it very difficult for an inference-based process to figure out the deeper underlying intent if they're maybe, stuck in some rabbit hole and there's a better way of achieving their actual goals. You can't actually infer their goals directly from their actions. And I think most importantly, especially in the creative process, there's a lot of uncertainty around intent. The creative process, if you've ever, written a novel or whatever, is a process of figuring out what you want to say and how you want to say it. And that means your intent doesn't really exist in a fully formed state in your head that you can then transcribe into the computer. Instead, it's something that you have to work out yourself through conversation with the materials and through thinking about the story you want to tell. And so this uncertainty is actually the biggest obstacle. Users don't know what they want, so we have to help them figure it out. And this lensing the imagination framework is basically a way of taking this idea of having a very short prompt to begin with, maybe just like cat pirate, a 2-word thing, which obviously in Midjourney gives you these super stereotypical cat pirates, right? They all have the same sort of like red bandana thing going on. These images don't really convey anything besides the concept of a cat who is a pirate, and helping users go from that to a more thematically inflected, specific interpretation of this initial like vague idea they've had of a cat pirate. So we might ask them things like, okay, thematically, are you maybe looking for a world where cat pirates are these like tyranny like oriented oppressors of mice, or maybe one where they're these cute fluffy animals that you're hanging out with on an island, or maybe one where you have this sort of like grim sci-fi setting where they're raiding human settlements to survive. And all of these lead to very different prompts, which lead to very different and much more specific images. And each of these different directions you could go in reflects a much more interesting, I think, creative intent or creative direction for your story. And so I'd much rather spend time in any of the worlds on the right than in the world with the very generic cat pirates on the left, just because they all imply much more interesting things to me. And so the goal is to kind of help people refract their initial vague impulses into something much more specific so that the models can make more sense out of that. And a bunch of different strategies can be tried to do this. I'm going to talk very briefly about 5 that we're doing right now. One of them is just asking users open-ended questions directly. So we can actually have the language model kind of formulate questions about the story world so far, and then ask users to type in some response to that. I have this default prompt that I play around with a lot called the Cold Emu War, which typically gives you a war between humans and emus that happens to be taking place in a cold setting rather than in Australia where the actual emu war took place. But in this particular instance, these questions that we just added to the model started taking it in a very different direction, where it implied that there was an alliance between emus and humans. So the emus and the humans are on the same side of this war now. And the war is actually between a bunch of different factions of birds, including the owls and the eagles and the emus and a whole bunch of others. And we ended up with this focal character, Talon, who has this childhood sweetheart who's one of the owls. And the question came up of whether Talon's sweetheart, Willow, after their paths diverged, might still bear some sympathy to the eagles, Talon's faction, or might have actually fully gone back to her roots as an owl. And this uncertainty about the fate of this character drove this in a very different narrative direction than we were expecting. So instead of this very basic bland Cold Emu War setting that we usually get, we got this much more really sort of like compelling wars between factions of birds with this romantic tension involved sort of thing that we were not expecting at all. And so this is, I think, a really powerful direction if you can get the model to ask these interesting questions. Strategy number 2, refining user intent via examples. If we've got this character on the left, but we don't know what the rest of the story is going to be about, what we can kind of do is proactively generate a whole bunch of different renderings of this character in different emotion sort of like contexts, in different settings, and try to kind of look at these different outputs that we've been giving the user and have them select the ones that are most reflective of their intent. So they can kind of interactively winnow this down to just the ones that are like accurate to the story they want to tell. We implicitly kind of reject the rest and put more weight on the tone or the vibe of the images they've selected as references. We can do the text as well. So basically kind of helping to winnow down what the user is looking for based on these examples. Strategy number 3, this is kind of a meta strategy that helps us with the others, is gauging users' creative momentum to help determine if they become fixated on something or if they're stuck in some way. So we can look at things like how many unanswered questions has the AI already asked versus how many times has the user actually like answered a question that the AI has been posing. Are they apparently active but not actually modifying the board contents in any real way? And especially, are they like spending 5+ minutes messing with the bio of a single character without really meaningfully changing that character's bio? All of these things might indicate that they become fixated or like overly focused on one particular corner of the world, and it might be good to intervene proactively to kind of draw them back out of that fixation. And obviously the specter of Clippy hangs over this whole approach, right? Every time you have an AI proactively generating interference in the creative process, you start to feel like, oh no, is the paperclip going to come get me? But I think it's important to like look in this direction, and we can probably build much better models now of when people want to be interrupted and how, including by training custom models on feedback that users have given us to avoid it feeling quite as aggressive as it did in the old Microsoft Word days. Strategy number 4, presenting users with diverse perspectives on half-finished artifacts, in this case, the story world as a whole. On the left-hand side, we've got this interface that we're working on called Patch View, which lets you define these custom visual semantic lenses on the space of characters and events and other entities you've defined in the story world so far. And you can see that we've got 2 lenses defined here. One is a very basic good to evil spectrum on which characters are arranged. And one of them is a more complicated 2-dimensional thing where characters can be high and low in magical power and high and low in physical power. And we can actually visualize the characters that exist so far in terms of where they fall on these spectrums. We can allow you to create a new character that's at a particular point on one of these spectrums by clicking in that point, and then have the model generate a character that meets that description, basically. We can drag an existing character or other story element around to have the model regenerate it to more accurately match the new position it's been relocated to. And we can actually even use this to see whether there's a hole in the cast of characters that we've built so far. So if everybody in our story world is high magic, then this kind of might implicitly suggest, oh, you might want to create some low magic characters as well, to kind of diversify character perspectives and give you like a broader take on the way this world feels to live in if you're not a magic user. And by letting people create a lot of these custom lenses and view the story through all these different dimensions or like perspectives, you can basically facilitate sense making of these much larger corpuses of narrative material than people would be able to readily make sense of in the purely physical setting. For instance, if you just had a bunch of index cards in front of you with no like support in indexing them in various ways. And strategy number 5 is providing model steering controls beyond text. A lot of ideas are very difficult to express specifically as textual prompts. And so we've seen a little bit already of how we're using style references and character references to basically allow images to be used as a way to specify user intent as well. But we're actually also excited about broader input types beyond just images as well. So for instance, we have here story arcs that can be drawn. The thing on the left is a system called Tailbrush that my coworker John built during his PhD, where you draw the arc of a story physically in terms of the character's fortunes, and a language model is steered to generate a story about that character that follows that arc. And so John's now working on my team, and we've implemented these similar kinds of arc inputs in Patchwork, where you can draw the arc of a particular character's fortunes, but also of the relationship between two characters, whether they like one another or not. The seriousness of the narration over time, the length of the words that are used in the text over time, and all those kinds of things, to basically vary these aesthetic qualities of the prose over time in a way that then directly allows you to shape or express your intent for dimensions of the aesthetics that would be very difficult to specify through text prompting alone. So by trying to move away from just text as an input, we can get people to express more of their intent through these better channels for expressing different aspects of their intent. Okay, so summing it all up very briefly. Language models are not yet ready to be good drama managers as much as we want them to be. We have the problem of unoriginality and the problem of uncontrollability. These problems are kind of in tension with one another, and any strategy you adopt to make one of them better tends to make the other one worse. What we can do is enable co-creative storytelling experiences with a language model where the users or the players are taking up more creative responsibility. And we see this as successful in the context of things like AI Dungeon and 1001 Nights, the good language model-based storytelling games so far. But to enable this, we actually need to get users to take more creative responsibility, which is hard because of underexpression, fixation, and uncertainty of intent, all of which are things that we can sort of build design solutions and AI solutions to in various ways. So we need to build interactive systems that elicit intent from users. And all of these problems cut across both the technical and design layers of these systems. So we end up needing both novel UI on the front end for getting people to put in their intent in better ways, and novel AI on the back end that can interpret this intent in a way that is coherent with the rest of the ideas that have been expressed so far. Okay, so if you want to read more about any of this stuff, here's 4 relatively representative papers from my back publications. More of this is coming soon, obviously. You can find all these on my website at the bottom right-hand corner, mkremins@github.io. But yeah, thank you. I'll take any questions now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Max. That was really, really interesting. If everyone can come off mutes so that we could start asking questions. I actually had one to start us off. Unless we have someone. Okay. Yeah. Max, you had talked about controllable chaos injection. I'm curious to hear more about how you and your team devise the like abstract outlines and how you come up with these, how you brainstorm the constraints for some of these. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Totally. Yeah. So I think there's actually 2 layers of constraints that we're looking at right now. One of these is very basic, like you almost always want these constraints to hold true if you're generating a story outline, period, sort of things. And for these, we can actually look to narratological theory a little bit. There's a pretty extensive literature now on the formal modeling of narratives in various ways. And we can kind of say, well, we know that we want, there to be some sort of conflict or tension in a story because most interesting stories have some degree of conflict or tension in them. And so drawing on these sort of almost narrative universals, or at least like cultural universals, can be a powerful sort of design approach there. Then there's the second layer of constraints that I think are much more conditional or genre specific, or even specific to user intents. And for these, you might want different things in different settings or in different worlds. So for instance, if you're telling a spy story, you might want to specify that like there's exactly one traitor among all the rest of the cast. And to express that kind of constraint rule, you might actually need to build like a meta rule that refers to some of the lower level rules and combines them in an interesting way. And so these genre specific rules are things that we're starting to write out as speculative, like maybe you can turn these on and off in the context of a particular story, or you even have like a genre setting that you enable that sort of applies as additional constraints to the space of possible outlines, if you happen to be writing a spy story right now, or a ghost story, or a murder mystery, or whatever. And these two layers, I think, are the most useful way of structuring it that we found so far. What we really love to be able to do is take the language model as a thing that can generate additional constraints. And so we're considering fine-tuning that so that users can then type in, I want to make sure this is true about my story, and have that be turned into an answer set programming constraint on the back end, which is something that's been done a little bit with planning already, where you can generate a formal planning domain from language model input as well. But we haven't actually done that work yet.
Great, thank you. All right, any questions, comments?
Sorry, Chen, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for such an exciting talk. And I'm so glad that you also mentioned there many of the problem are, I guess, is we're trying to understand users' design intent from the HCI perspective as how we can elucidate and help user to think about the problem. I think most of the time is like those problem and solution, they're co-evolving, right, as you're designing even with traditional tools. I think part of the challenges we're finding here is like intent itself is a very general term. And I think sometimes when people are trying to use a tool in their workflow is, as you mentioned, there are constraints that has to be fulfilled. Most of our project requirements, some of them are maybe preconditions, feedback from colleagues, from clients. I'm wondering like how, like whether you have any hints or clues or suggestions as how we can help user to define the space where they have the freedom to express, to explore, while kind of fulfill the requirements that they have to fulfill. So that help them to cut up that subspace while helping to, define the question exactly that they have.
Totally. Yeah. So we've been fortunate enough that the experience of co-creative storytelling is the thing that we're trying to facilitate. And there's not like a lot of formal constraints on the output of the process as a result of that. So I haven't thought as much about the very domain specific, like production oriented things that you would see in like, game design workflows, for instance. But I do think there are some strategies that you can probably adopt to help with constraining the output of the tools in a way that is compatible with your workflow. One of them is this exact kind of like neurosymbolic back and forth between a constraint solver or some similar sort of like planning system or whatever, and the language model itself, where you can maybe do some additional checking on the language model outputs directly by asking the language model to itself summarize, are these constraints met for this output, and kind of rejecting cases where that's not true. And that's, I think, one thing we've tried a little bit that we've found to be useful, but not useful enough to like build into our own stuff yet. The other thing I think is I'm actually really excited about this push towards malleable software that language models could theoretically enable, where people can create very small bespoke software tools on the fly by describing the behavior of that tool, and then use that tool as the thing that is in their workflow as opposed to the language model directly. So that malleable software approach strikes me as very promising, although not one that I've explored directly.
Great. Any other questions for Max, our guest? Okay, well, thank you, Max, so much for your talk. I want to also thank you for sponsoring the talk as well, and for everyone who joined. I will stay on for a little bit in case anyone has more questions about our series. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, if you have other speakers you'd like to recommend, I am throwing a hyperlink in our chat right now, so you could go ahead and share this with future speakers for our series. Thank you for joining today. We have
Thank you.
another talk tomorrow.
Thank you, Max.
Bye.
Thank you, Max.
Great
Cool.
talk,
Thank
Max.
you.
Good to meet you all.
You.